Metamorphoses by Ovid, written 1 ACE, translated by Sir Samuel Garth, John Dryden et al., Book the Sixth. The transformation of Arachne into a spider. Pallas, attending to the Muses' song, approved the just resentment of their wrong, and thus reflects, while tamely I commend those who their injured deities defend. My own divinity affronted stands, and calls aloud for justice at my hands. Then takes the hint, ashamed to lag behind, and on Arachne bends her vengeful mind. One at the loom so excellently skilled, that to the goddess she refused to yield. Low was her birth, and small her native town, she from art alone obtained renown. Idmon, her father, made it his employ to give the spongy fleece a purple dye. Of vulgar strain her mother, lately dead, with her own rank had been content to wed. Yet she, their daughter, though her time was spent in a small hamlet, and of mean descent, through the great towns of Lydia gained a name, and filled the neighboring countries with her fame. Oft, to admire the niceness of her skill, the nymphs would quit their fountain, shade, or hill. Thither from the green Timolus they repair, and leave the vineyards their peculiar care. Thither from the famed Pactolus, golden stream. Drawn by her art, the curious naiads came, nor would the work when finished please so much as, while she wrought, to view each graceful touch. Whether the shapeless woolen ball she wound, or with quick motion turned the spindle round, or with her pencil drew the neat design, Pallas her mistress shone in every line. This the proud maid with scornful air denies, and even the goddess at her work defies, disowns her heavenly mistress every hour, nor asks her aid, nor deprecates her power. Let us, she cries, but to a trial come, and if she conquers, let her fix my doom. The goddess then a beldame's form put on, with silver hairs her hoary temples shone. Propped by a staff, she hobbles in her walk, and tottering thus begins old wives' talk. Young maid attend, nor stubbornly despise the admonitions of the old and wise, for age, though scorned, a ripe experience bears that golden fruit unknown to blooming years. Still may remotest fame your labors crown, and mortals your superior genius own. But to the goddess yield, and humbly meek a pardon for your bold presumption seek. The goddess will forgive. And this the maid with passion fired, her gliding shuttle stayed, and her darting vengeance with an angry look to Pallas in disguise thus fiercely spoke. Thou doting thing, whose idle babbling tongue but too well shows the plague of living long, hence and reprove with your sage advice your giddy daughter of your awkward niece. No, I despise your counsel, and am still a woman ever wedded to my will. And if your skillful goddess better knows, let her accept the trial I propose. She does, impatient Pallas straight replies, and clothed with heavenly light sprung from her disguise. The nymphs and virgins of the plain adore the awful goddess, and confess her power. The maid alone stood unappalled, yet showed a transient blush, that for a moment glowed, then disappeared, as purple streaks adorn the open beauties of the rosy morn, till Phoebus, rising prevalently bright, allays the tincture with his silver light. Yet she persists in obstinately great, in hopes of conquest, hurries on her fate. The goddess now the challenge waives no more, nor kindly good advises as before. Straight to their post appointed both repair, and fix their threaded looms with equal care. Around the solid beam the web is tied, while hollow canes the parting warp divide, through which with nimble flight the shuttles play, and for the woof prepare a ready way. The woof and warp unite, pressed by the toothy sleigh. Thus both, their mantles buttoned to their breast, their skillful fingers ply with willing haste, and work with pleasure, while they cheer the eye with glowing purple of the Tyrian dye. Or justly intermixing shades with light, their colorings insensibly unite. as when a shower transpierced with sunny rays its mighty arch along the heaven displays, from whence 1,000 different colors rise, whose fine transition cheats the clearest eyes. So like the intermingled shading seems, and only differs in the last extremes. Then threads of gold both artfully dispose, and as each part in just proportion rose, some antique fable in their work disclose. Pallas in figures wrought the heavenly powers, and Mars's hills among the Athenian towers. On lofty thrones twice 6 celestials sate, Jove in the midst, and held their warm debate. The subject weighty and well known to fame, from whom the city should receive its name. Each god by proper features was expressed. Jove with majestic mane excelled the rest. His 3-forked mace the dewy sea god shook, and looked sternly smote the ragged rock, when from the stone leapt forth a sprightly steed, and Neptune claims the city for the deed. Herself she blazes with a glittering spear, and crested helm that veiled her braided hair, with shield and scaly breastplate, implements of war. Struck with her pointed lance, the teeming earth seemed to produce a new surprising birth, when from the glebe the pledges of conquest sprung, a tree pale green with fairest olives hung. And then, to let her giddy rival learn what just reward such boldness was to earn, 4 trials at each corner had their part, designed in miniature and touched with art. Haemus in one, Rhodope of Thrace, transformed to mountains, filled the foremost place, who claimed the titles of the gods above and vainly used the epithets of Jove. Another showed where the Pygmean dame, profaning Juno's venerable name, turned to an airy crane, descends from far, and with her pygmy subjects wages war. In a third part, the rage of heaven's great queen, displayed on proud Antigone, was seen, who with presumptuous boldness dared to vie for beauty with the empress of the sky. Ah, what avails her ancient princely race, her sire a king, and Troy her native place? Now to a noisy stork transformed she flies, and with her whitened pinions cleaves the skies. And in the last remaining part was drawn poor Cinyras, that seemed to weep in stone. Clasping the temple steps, he sadly mourned his lovely daughters, now to marble turned. With her own tree, the finished piece, she is crowned, and wreaths of peaceful olive all the work surround. Arachne drew the famed intrigues of Jove, changed to a bull to gratify his love. How through the briny tide all-forming whore, lovely Europa on his back he bore. The sea seemed waving, and the trembling maid shrunk up her tender feet as if afraid, and looking back on the forsaken strand to her companions, wafts her distant hand. Next, she designed Asteria's fable rape, when Jove assumed a soaring eagle's shape, and showed how Leda lay supinely pressed, whilst the soft snowy swan sate hovering o'er her breast. How in a satyr's form the god beguiled, when fair Antiope with twins he filled. Then, like Amphitryon, but a real Jove, in fair Alcmena's arms he cooled his love. In fluid gold to Danae's heart he came, Aegina felt him in lambent flame. He took Mnemosyne in shepherd's make, and for Dios was a speckled snake. She made thee, Neptune, like a wanton steer, pacing the meads for love of Arn dear. Next, like a stream, thy burning flame to slake, and like a ram, for fair Basaltis' sake. Then Ceres, in a steed your vigor tried, nor could the mare the yellow goddess hide. Next, to a fowl transformed, you won by force, the snake-haired mother of the winged horse, and in a dolphin's fishy form subdued Melanthus sweet beneath the oozy flood. All these the maid with lively features drew, and opened proper landscapes to the view. There Phoebus, roving like a country swain, attunes his jolly pipe along the plain, for lovely Isis' sake, in shepherd's weeds, or pastures green his bleating flock he feeds. There Bacchus, imaged like the clustering grape, melting bedrops Eregine's fair lap. And there old Saturn, stung with youthful heat, formed like a stallion, rushes to the feet. Fresh flowers with twists of ivy intertwine, mingling a running foliage, close the neat design. This the bright goddess passionately moved, with envy saw, yet inwardly approved. The scene of heavenly guilt with haste she tore, nor longer the affront with patience bore. A box and shuttle in her hand she took, and more than once Arachne's forehead struck. The unhappy maid, impatient of the wrong, down from a beam her injured person hung, when Pallas, pitying her wretched state, at once prevented and pronounced her fate. Live, but depend, vile wretch, the goddess cried, doomed in suspense for ever to be tied, that all your race, to utmost date of time, may feel the vengeance and detest the crime. Then going off, she sprinkled her with juice, which leaves of baneful aconite produce. Touched with the poisonous drug, her flowing hair fell to the ground, and left her temples bare. Her usual features vanished from their place, her body lessened all, but most her face. Her slender fingers, hanging on each side with many joints, the use of legs supplied. A spider's bag the rest, from which she gives a thread, and still by constant weaving lives. The story of Niobe. Swift through the Phrygian towns the rumor flies, and the strange news each female tongue employs. Niobe, who before she married knew the famous nymph, now found the story true, yet unreclaimed by poor Arachne's fate, vainly above the gods' assumed estate. Her husband's power, their family's descent, their power and rich dominions wide extent, might well have justified a decent pride, but not on these alone the dame relied. Her lovely progeny that far excelled the mother's heart with vain ambition swelled. The happiest mother not unjustly styled had no conceited thoughts her towering fancy filled. For once a prophetess with zeal inspired, their slow neglect to warm devotion fired through every street of Thebes who had ran possessed, and thus, in accents wild, her charge expressed. Haste, haste, ye Theban matrons, and adore with hallowed rites Latona's mighty power, and to the heavenly twins, that from her spring with laurel crowned, your smoking incense bring. Straight the great summons every dame obeyed, and due submission to the goddess paid. Graceful with laurel chaplets dressed they came, and offered incense in the sacred flame. Meanwhile, surrounded with a courtly guard, the royal Niobe in state appeared, attired in robes embroidered over with gold, and mad with rage, yet lovely to behold. Her comely tresses trembling as she stood, down her fine neck with easy motion flowed. Then, darting round a proud, disdainful look, in haughty tone her hasty passion broke, and thus began. What madness this, to court a goddess, founded merely on report? Dare ye your poor pretended power invoke, while yet no altars to my godhead smoke? Mine, whose immediate lineage stands confessed from Tantalus, the only mortal guest that e'er the gods admitted to their feast. A sister of the Pleiades gave me birth, an Atlas mightiest mountain upon earth, who bears the globe of all the stars above, my grandsire was, and Atlas sprung from Jove. The Theban towns my majesty adored, and neighboring Phrygia trembles at my power. Raised by my husband's lute, with turrets crowned, our lofty city stands secured around. Within my court, where'er I turn my eyes, unbounded treasures to my prospect rise. With these my face I modestly may name, as not unworthy of so high a claim. 7 are my daughters of a form divine, with 7 fair sons, an indefective line. Go, fools, consider this, and ask the cause from which my pride a strong presumption draws. Consider this, and then prefer to me Chaos, the Titan's vagrant progeny, to whom in travel the whole spacious earth no room afforded for her spurious birth. Not the least part in earth, in heaven or seas, would grant your outlawed goddess any ease, till pitying hers from his own wandering case, Delos, the floating island, gave a place. There she a mother was, of two at most, only the seventh part of what I boast. My joys all are beyond suspicion fixed, with no pollutions or misfortune mixed. Safe on the basis of my power I stand, above the reach of fortune's fickle hand. Lessen she may my inexhausted store, and much destroyed, yet still must leave me more. Suppose it possible that some may die of this my numerous lovely progeny, still with Latona I might safely vie, who by her scanty breed scarce fit to name, but just escapes the childless woman's shame. Go then, with speed your laureled heads uncrown, and leave the silly farce you have begun. The timorous throng their sacred rites forbore, and from their heads the verdant laurel tore. Their haughty queen they with regret obeyed, and still in gentle murmurs softly prayed. High on top of Cynthia's shady mount, with grief the goddess saw the base affront, and the abuse revolving in her breast. The mother her twin offspring thus addressed: Lo, I, my children, who with comfort knew your godlike birth, and thence my glory drew, and thence have claimed precedency of place from all but Juno of the heavenly race, must now despair and languish in disgrace. My godhead questioned, and all my rights divine, unless you succor, banished from my shrine. Nay, more, the imp of Tantalus has flung reflections with her vile paternal tongue, has dared prefer her mortal breed to mine, and called me childless, which just fate may she repine. When to urge more the goddess was prepared, Phoebus in haste replies, Too much we've heard, and every moment's lost while vengeance is deferred. Diana spoke the same. Then both enshroud their heavenly bodies in a sable cloud, and to the Theban towers descending light through the soft yielding air direct their flight. Without the wall there lies a champion ground, with even surface far extending round, beaten and levelled while it daily feels the trampling horse and chariot's grinding wheels, part of proud Niobe's young rival breed, practising there to ride the managed steed. Their bridles bossed with gold were mounted high on stately furniture of Tyrian dye. Of these, Ismenos, who by birth had been the first fair issue of the fruitful queen, just as he drew the rein to guide his horse around the compass of the circling course, sighed deeply, and the pangs of smart expressed, while the shaft stuck engorged within his breast. And the reins dropping from his dying hand, he sunk quite down and tumbled on the sand. Cybelus next the rattling quiver heard, and with full speed for his escape prepared, as when the pilot from the blackening skies a gathering storm of wintry rain descries. His sails unfurled and crowded all with wind, he strives to leave the threatening cloud behind. So fled the youth, but an unerring dart overtook him, quickly discharged, and sped with art, fixed in his neck behind. It trembling stood, and at his throat displayed the point besmeared with blood. Prone, as his posture was, he tumbled over, and bathed his courser's mane with steaming gore. Next, at young Phedamus they took their aim, and Tantalus, who bore his grandsire's name. These, when their other exercise was done, to try the wrestler's oily sport begun, and straining every nerve their skill expressed in closest grapple, joining breast to breast, when from the bending bow an arrow sent, joined as they were, through both their bodies went. Both groaned, and writhing both their limbs with pain, they fell together bleeding on the plain. Then both their languid eyeballs faintly rowl, and thus together breathe away their soul. With grief, Elphenor saw their doleful plight, and smote his breast, and sickened at the sight. Then to their succor ran with eager haste, and fondly grieved their stiffening limbs embraced. But in the action falls a thrilling dart, by Phoebus guided, pierced him to the heart. This, as they drew it forth, his midriff tore. Its barbed point the fleshy fragments bore, and let the soul gush out in streams of purple gore. But Damascathon, by a double wound, beardless and young, lay gasping on the ground. Fixed in his sinewy ham, the steely point struck through his knee and pierced the nervous joint. And as he stooped to tug the painful dart, another struck him in a vital part. Shot through his weason, by the wing it hung, the lifeblood forced it out, and darting upward sprung. Ilinius, the last, with terror stands, lifting in prayer his unavailing hands, and ignorant from whom his griefs arise. "Spare me, all ye heavenly powers," he cries. Phoebus was touched too late. The sounding bow had sent the shaft, and struck the fatal blow, which yet but gently gored his tender side. So by a slight and easy wound he died. Swift to the mother's ears the rumor came, and doleful sighs the heavy news proclaim. With anger and surprise inflamed by turns, and furious rage her haughty stomach burns. First she disputes the effects of heavenly power, then at their daring boldness wonders more. For poor Amphion, with sore grief distressed, hoping to soothe his cares by endless rest, had sheathed the dagger in his wretched breast. And she, who tossed her high disdainful head, when through the streets in solemn pomp she led the throng that Latona's altar fled, assuming state beyond the proudest queen, was now the miserablest object seen. Prostrate among the clay cold dead she fell, and kissed an undistinguished last farewell. Then her pale arms advancing to the skies, "Cruel Latona, triumph now," she cries. "My grieving soul in bitter anguish drench, and with my woes your thirsty passion quench. Feast your black malice at a price thus dear, while the sore pangs of 7 such deaths I bear. Triumph, too cruel rival, and display your conquering standard, for you've won the day, yet I'll excel. For yet, though 7 are slain, superior still in number I remain." Scarce had she spoke, the bowstring's twanging sound was heard, and dealt fresh terrors all around, which all but Niobe alone confound. Stunned and obdurate by her load of grief, insensible she sits, nor hopes relief. Before the funeral biers, all weeping sad, her daughter stood in vests of sable clad. When one, surprised and stung with sudden smart, in vain attempts to draw the sticking dart. But to grim death her blooming youth resigns, and o'er her brother's corpse her dying head reclines. This to assuage her mother's anguish tries, and silenced in the pious action, dies. Shot by secret sorrow, winged with death, her faltering lips but only gasps for breath. One on her dying sister breathes her last. Vainly in flight another's hopes are placed. This, hiding from her fate, a shelter seeks, that trembling stands and fills the air with shrieks. And all in vain, for now all 6 had found their way to death, each by a different wound. The last with eager care the mother veiled, behind her spreading mantle closed concealed, and with her body guarded as a shield. Only for this youngest I implore, grant me this one request. I ask no more. Oh, grant me this, she passionately cries. But while she speaks, the destined virgin dies. The transformation of Niobe. Widowed and childless, lamentable state, a doleful sight among the dead she sate, hardened with woes, a statue of despair, to every breath of wind, unmoved her hair. Her cheek still reddening, but its color dead, faded her eyes and set within her head. No more pliant tongue its motion keeps, but stands congealed within her frozen lips, stagnant and dull. Within her purple veins its current stopped, the lifeless blood remains. Her feet their usual offices refuse, her arms and neck their graceful gestures lose. Action and life from every part are gone, and even her entrails turned to solid stone. Yet still she weeps, and whirled by stormy winds, borne through the air her native country finds. There fixed she stands, upon a bleaky hill, there yet her marble cheeks eternal tears distill. The peasants of Lycia transformed to frogs. Then, all reclaimed by this example, showed a due regard for each peculiar god. Both men and women their devours expressed, and great Latona's awful power confessed. Then, tracing instances of older time to suit the nature of present crime, thus one begins his tale, where Lycia yields a golden harvest from its fertile fields. Some churlish peasants in the days of yore provoked the goddess to exert her power. The thing, indeed, the meanness of the place had made obscure, surprising as it was. But I myself once happened to behold this famous lake of which the story's told. My father, then worn out by length of days, nor able to sustain the tedious ways, me with a guide had sent the plains to roam, and drive his well-fed straggling heifers home. Here, as we sauntered through the verdant meads, we spied a lake o'ergrown with trembling reeds, whose wavy tops an opening scene disclose, from which an antique smoky altar rose. I, as my superstitious guide had done, stopped short and blessed myself, and then went on. Yet I inquired to whom the altar stood, Phanes, the Naiads, or some native god. No sylvan deity, my friend replies, enshrined within this hallowed altar lies. For this, O youth, to that famed goddess stands, whom, at the imperial Juno's rough commands, of every quarter of the earth bereaved Delos, the floating isle, at length received, who there, in spite of enemies, brought forth beneath an olive shade her great twin birth. Hence, too, she fled the furious Stepdane's power, and in her arms a double godhead bore. And now the borders of fair Lycia gained, just when the summer solstice parched the land. With thirst the goddess languishing, no more her empty breast would yield its milky store, when from below the smiling valley showed a silver lake that in its bottom flowed. A sort of clowns were reaping near the bank, the bending osier and the bulrush dank, the cress and water lily, fragrant weed whose juicy stalk the liquid fountains feed. The goddess came, and kneeling on the brink, stooped at the fresh repast, prepared to drink. Then thus, being hindered by the rabble race, in accents mild expostulates the case. Water I only ask, and sure 'tis hard from nature's common rights to be debarred. This, as the genial sun and vital air, should flow alike to every creature's share. Yet still I ask, and as a favour crave, that which a public bounty nature gave. Nor do I seek my weary limbs to drench, only with one cool draught my thirst I'd quench. Now, from my throat the usual moisture dries, and even my voice in broken accents dies. One draught as dear as life I should esteem, and water now I thirst would nectar seem. Oh, let my little babes your pity move, and melt your hearts to charitable love. They, as by chance they did, extend to you their little hands, and request pursue. Whom would these soft persuasions not subdue, though the most rustic and unmannered crew? Yet they the goddess's request refuse, and with rude words reproachfully abuse. Nay more, with spiteful feet the villains trod o'er the soft bottom of the marshy flood, and blackened all the lake with clouds of rising mud. Her thirst by indignation was suppressed. Bent on revenge, the goddess stood confessed, her suppliant hands uplifting to the skies. For redress to heaven now, she replies. And may you live, she passionately cried, doomed in that pool forever to abide. The goddess has her wish, for now they choose to plunge and dive among the watery ooze. Sometimes they show their head above the brim, and on the glassy surface spread to swim. Often upon the bank their station take, then spring and leap into the coolie lake. Still void of shame, they lead a clamorous life, and croaking still scold on in endless strife. Compelled to live beneath the liquid stream, where they still quarrel and attempt to scream. Now from their bloated throat their voice puts on imperfect murmurs in a hoarser tone. Their noisy jaws with bawling now grown wide, an ugly sight, extend on either side, their motley backs streaked with a list of green, joined to their head without a neck is seen, and with a belly broad and white they look mere frogs, and still frequent the muddy brook. The fate of Marsyas. Scarce had the man this famous story told of vengeance on the Lycians shown of old, when straight another pictures to their view the satyr's fate, whom angry Phoebus slew, who raised with high conceit and puffed with pride, at his own pipe the skilful god defied. "Why do you tear me from myself?" he cries. "Ah, cruel, must my skin be made the prize? This for a silly pipe?" He roaring said. Meanwhile the skin from off his limbs was flayed, all bare and raw, one large continued wound. With streams of blood his body bathed the ground. The bluish veins their trembling pulse disclosed. The stringing nerves lay naked and exposed. His guts appeared distinctly, each expressed with every shining fibre of his breast. The fauns and sylvans with the nymphs that rove among the satyrs in the shady grove, Olympus known of old, and every swain that fed or flock or herd upon the plain, bewailed the loss, and with their tears that flowed a kindly moisture on the earth bestowed, that soon conjoined and in a body ranged, sprung from the ground to limpid water change, which down through Phrygia's rocks a mighty stream comes tumbling to the sea, and Marcia is its name. The story of Pelops. From these relations straight the people turn to present truths, and lost Amphion mourn. The mother most was blamed, yet some relate that Pelops pitied and bewailed her fate, and stripped his clothes, and laid his shoulder bare, and made the ivory miracle appear. This shoulder from the first was formed of flesh, as lively as the other, and as fresh. But when the youth was by his father slain, the gods restored his mangled limbs again. Only that place which joins the neck and arm, and the rest untouched, was found to suffer harm, the loss of which an ivory piece sustained, and thus the youth his limbs and life regained. The story of Tereus, Procne, and Philomena. To Thebes the neighboring princes all repair, and with condolence the misfortune share, each bordering state in solemn form addressed, and each betimes a friendly grief expressed. Argos with Sparta's and Mycenae's towns, and Calydon yet free from fierce Diana's frowns, Corinth for the finest brass, well famed of old, Orthomenos for men of courage bold, Clyne lying in the lowly dale, and rich Messene with its fertile vale, Pylos for Nestor's city after famed, and Trozen not as yet from Pythias named, and those fair cities which are hemmed round by double seas within the Isthmian ground, and those which farther from the sea-coast stand, lodged in the bosom of the spacious land. Who can believe it? Athens was the last, though for politeness famed for ages past, for a strait siege which then their walls enclosed, such acts of kind humanity opposed. And thick with ships from foreign nations bound, seaward their city lay invested round. These with auxiliar forces led from far. Tereus of Thrace, brave and inured to war, had quite defeated, and obtained a name the warriors due among the sons of fame. This, with his wealth and power, an ancient line from Mars derived, Pandion's thoughts incline his daughter Procne with the prince to join. Nor Hymen nor the Graces here preside, nor Juno to befriend the blooming bride, but fiends with funeral brands the process led, and Furies waited at the genial bed, and all night long the screeching owl aloof, with baleful notes, sate brooding o'er the roof. With such ill omens was the match begun, that made them parents of a hopeful son. Now Thrace congratulates their seeming joy, and they in thankful rites their minds employ. If the fair queen's espousals pleased before, Itys, the new-born prince, now pleases more, and each bright day the birth and bridal feast were kept with hallowed pomp above the rest. So far true happiness may lie concealed, when by false lights we fancy 'tis revealed. Now, since their nuptials had the golden sun 5 courses around his ample zodiac run, when gentle Procne thus her lord addressed, and spoke the secret wishes of her breast. "If I," she said, "have ever favour found, let my petition with success be crowned. Let me at Athens my dear sister see, or let her come to Thrace and visit me. And lest my father should absence her mourn, promise that she'll make a quick return. With thanks, I'd own the obligation due, and only, O Tereus, to the gods and you." Now plied with oar and sail at his command, the nimble galleys reached the Athenian land and anchored in the famed Pierian bay, while Tereus to the palace takes his way. The king salutes, and ceremonies past, begins the fatal embassy at last. The occasion of his voyage he declares, and, with his own, his wife's request prefers. Asks leave that only for a little space their lovely sister might embark for Thrace. Thus, while he spoke, appeared the royal maid, bright Philomena, splendidly arrayed, but most attractive in her charming face, and comely person turned with every grace, like those fair nymphs that are described to rove across the glades and openings of the grove. Only that these are dressed for sylvan sports, and less become the finery of courts. Tereus beheld the virgin, and admired, and with the coals of burning lust was fired. Like crackling stubble, or the summer hay, when forked lightnings o'er the meadows play, such charms in any breast might kindle love. But him the heats of inbred lewdness move, to which through Thrace is naturally prone. Yet his is still superior, and his own. Straight her attendance he designs to buy, and with large bribes her governess would try. Herself with ample gifts resolves to bend, and his whole kingdom in the attempt expend, or snatched away by force of arms to bear and justify the rape with open war. The boundless passion boils within his breast, and his projecting soul admits no rest. And now, impatient of the least delay, by pleading Procne's cause he speeds his way. The eloquence of love his tongue inspires, and in his wife's he speaks his own desires. Hence, all his importunities arise, and tears unmanly trickle from his eyes. Ye gods, what thick involving darkness blinds the stupid faculties of mortal minds! Tereus the credit of good nature gains from these his crimes, so well the villain feigns, and unsuspecting of his base designs, in the request fair Philomena joins. Her snowy arms her aged sire embrace, and clasp his neck with an endearing grace. Only to see her sister she entreats, a seeming blessing which a curse completes. Tereus surveys her with a luscious eye, and in his mind forestalls the blissful joy. Her circling arms a scene of lust inspire, and every kiss foments the raging fire. Fondly he wishes for the father's place to feel, and to return the warm embrace, since not the nearest ties of filial blood would damp his flame and force him to be good. At length, for both their sakes, the king agrees, and Philomela, on her bended knees, thanks him for what her fancy calls success, when cruel fate intends her nothing less. Now Phoebus, hastening to ambrosial rest, his fiery steeds drove sloping down the west. The sculptured gold with sparkling wines was filled, and with rich meats each cheerful table smiled. Plenty and mirth the royal banquet close, then all retire to sleep and sweet repose. But the lewd monarch, though withdrawn apart, still feels love's poison rankling in his heart. Her face divine is stamped within his breast. Fancy imagines and improves the rest, and thus, kept waking by intense desire, he nourishes his own prevailing fire. Next day the good old king for Tereus sends, and to his charge the virgin recommends. his hands with tears the indulgent father pressed, then spoke, and thus with tenderness addressed: "Since the kind instances of pious love do all pretence of obstacle remove, since Procne's and her own with your request overrule the fears of a paternal breast, with you, dear son, my daughter I entrust, and by the gods adjure you to be just, by truth in every consanguineal tie, to watch and guard her with a father's eye. And since the least delay will tedious prove, in keeping from my sight the child I love, with speed return her, kindly to assuage the tedious troubles of my lingering age. And you, Philomela, let it suffice to know your sister's banished from my eyes. If in any sense of duty sways your mind, let me from you the shortest absence find." He wept, then kissed his child, and while he speaks, the tears fall gently down his aged cheeks. Next, as a pledge of fealty, he demands, and with a solemn charge conjoins their hands. Then to his daughter and his grandson sends, and by their mouth a blessing recommends. While in a voice with dire forebodings broke, sobbing and faint, the last farewell was spoke. Now Philomela, scarce received on board, and in the royal gilded bark secured, beheld the dashes of the bending oar, the ruffled sea, and the receding shore. When straight his joy impatient of disguise, "We've gained our point," the rough barbarian cries. "Now I possess the dear, the blissful hour, and every wish subjected to my power. Transports of his lust vicious thoughts employ, and he forbears with pain the expected joy. His gloating eyes incessantly surveyed the virgin beauties of the lovely maid, as when the bold rapacious bird of Jove, with crooked talons stooping from above, has snatched and carried to his lofty nest a captive hare, with cruel gripe suppressed. Secure, with fixed and unrelenting eyes, he sits and views the helpless, trembling prize. Their vessels now had made the intended land, and all with joy descend upon the strand, when the false tyrant seized the princely maid, and to a lodge in distant woods conveyed, pale, sinking, and distressed with jealous fears, and asking for her sister all in tears. The letter, for enjoyment fully bent, no longer now concealed his base intent, but with rude haste the bloomy girl deflowered, tender, defenseless, and with ease overpowered. Her piercing accents to her sire complain, and to her absent sister, but in vain. In vain she importunes with doleful cries each unattentive godhead of the skies. She pants and trembles like the bleeding prey from some close-hunted wolf just snatched away, that still with fearful horror looks around, and on its flank regards the bleeding wound. Or, as the timorous dove, the danger o'er, beholds her shining plumes besmeared with gore, and though delivered from the falcon's claw, yet shivers, and retains a secret awe. But when her mind a calm reflection shared, and all her scattered spirits were repaired, torn and disordered, while her tresses hung, her livid hands like one that mourned she wrung. Then thus, with grief overwhelmed her languid eyes, "Savage, inhumane, cruel wretch," she cries, "whom not a parent's strict commands could move, though charged and uttered with the tears of love, nor virgin innocence, nor all that's due to the strong contract of the nuptial vow. Virtue by this in wild confusions lay, I compelled to wrong my sister's bed, whilst you, regardless of your marriage oath, with stains of incest have defiled us both. Though I deserve some punishment to find, this was, ye gods, too cruel and unkind. Yet, villain, to complete your hard guilt, stab here, and let my tainted blood be spilt. Oh, happy had it come, before I knew the cursed embrace of vile perfidious you, then my pale ghost, pure from incestuous love, had wandered spotless through the Elysian grove. But if the gods above have power to know and judge those actions that are done below, unless the dreaded thunders of the sky like me subdued and violated lie, still my revenge shall take its proper time, and suit the baseness of your hellish crime. myself abandoned and devoid of shame, through the wide world your actions will proclaim. And though I'm imprisoned in this lonely den, obscured and buried from the sight of men, my mournful voice the pitying rock shall move, and my complainings echo through the grove. Hear me, O heaven, and if God be there, let him regard me and accept my prayer. Struck with these words, the tyrant's guilty breast with fear and anger was by turns possessed. Now with remorse his conscience deeply stung, he drew the falchion that beside her hung, and first her tender arms behind her bound, then dragged her by the hair along the ground. The princess willingly her throat reclined, and viewed the steel with a contented mind. But soon her tongue the girding pincher strain. With anguish, soon she feels the piercing pain. Oh, Father, Father, would have fain have spoke, but the sharp torture her intention broke. In vain she tries, but now the blade is cut, her tongue sheer off, close to the trembling root. The mangled part still quivered on the ground, murmuring with a faint, imperfect sound. And as the serpent writhes his wounded train, uneasy, panting, and possessed with pain, the piece, while life remained, still trembled fast, and to its mistress pointed to the last. Yet after this so damned and black a deed, fame, which I scarce can credit, has agreed that on her rifled charms, still void of shame, he frequently indulged his lustful flame. At last he ventures to his Procne's sight, loaded with guilt and cloyed with long delight. There, with a feigned grief and false dissembled sighs, begins a formal narrative of lies. Her sister's death he artfully declares, then weeps and raises credit from his tears. Her vest with flowers of gold embroidered over, with grief distressed the mournful matron tore, and a beseeming suit of gloomy sable wore. With cost an honorary tomb she raised, and thus the imaginary ghost appeased. Deluded queen, the fate of her you love, nor grief nor pity, but revenge should move. Through the 12 signs had passed the circling sun, and round the compass of the zodiac run. What must unhappy Philomena do, forever subject to her keeper's view? Huge walls of massy stone the lodge surround, from her own mouth no way of speaking's found. But all our wants by wit may be supplied, and art makes up what fortune has denied. With skill exact a Phrygian web she strung, fixed to a loom that in her chamber hung, where in wrought letters upon white displayed in purple notes her wretched case betrayed. The piece, when finished, secretly she gave into the charge of one poor menial slave, and then with gestures made him understand it must be safe conveyed to Procne's hand. The slave with speed the queen's apartment sought, and rendered up his charge, unknowing what he brought. But when the ciphers figured in each fold, her sister's melancholy story told, strange that she could with silence. She surveyed the tragic piece, and without weeping read. In such tumultuous haste her passion sprung, they choked her voice, and quite disarmed her tongue. No room for female tears, the furies rise, darting vindictive glances from her eyes, and stung with rage, she bounds from place to place, while stern revenge sits lowering in her face. Now the triennial celebration came, observed to Bacchus by each Thracian dame. When in the privacies of night retired, they act his rites, with sacred rapture fired. By night the tinkling cymbals ring round, while the shrill notes from repose resound. By night the queen, disguised, forsakes the court, to mingle in the festival resort. Leaves of the curling vine her temples shade, and with a circling wreath adorn her head. Adown her back the stag's rough spoils appear, light on her shoulders leans a cornel spear. Thus, in the fury of the god concealed, Procne her own mad headstrong passion veiled. Now with her gang to the thick wood she flies, and with religious yellings fills the skies. The fatal law, as 'twere by chance, she seeks, and through the bolted doors an entrance breaks. From thence her sister snatching by the hand, massed like the ranting bacchanalian band, within the limits of the court she drew, shading with ivy green her outward hue. But Philomela, conscious of the place, felt new reviving pangs of her disgrace, and shivering cold prevailed in every part, and the chilled blood ran trembling to her heart. Soon, as the queen a fit retirement found, stripped of the garlands that her temples crowned, she straight unveiled her blushing sister's face, and fondly clasped her with a close embrace. But in confusion lost, the unhappy maid, with shame dejected, hung her drooping head, as guilty of a crime that stained her sister's bed. That speech, that should her injured virtue clear, and make her spotless innocence appear, is now no more. Only her hands and eyes appeal in signals to the conscious skies. In Procne's breast the rising passions boil, and burst in anger with a mad recoil. Her sister's ill-timed grief with scorn she blames. Then, in these furious words, her rage proclaims. Tears unavailing but defer our time. The stabbing sword must expiate the crime, or worse, if wit on bloody vengeance bent, a weapon more tormenting can invent. Oh, sister, I've prepared my stubborn heart to act some hellish and unheard of part. Either the palace to surround with fire, and see the villain in the flames expire, or with a knife dig out his cursed eyes, or his false tongue with racking engine seize, or cut away the part that injured you, and through 1,000 wounds his guilty soul pursue. Tortures enough my passion has designed, but the variety distracts my mind. A while, thus wavering, stood the furious dame, when Ida's fondling to his mother came. From him the cruel fatal hint she took. She viewed him with a stern, remorseless look. "Ah, but too like thy wicked sire," she said, forming the direful purpose in her head. At this, a sullen grief her voice suppressed, while silent passions struggled in her breast. Now at her lap arrived, the flattering boy salutes his parent with a smiling joy. About her neck his little arms are thrown, and he accosts her in a prattling tone. Then her tempestuous anger was allayed, and in its full career her vengeance stayed. While tender thoughts in spite of passion rise, and melting tears disarm her threatening eyes. But when she found the mother's easy heart too fondly swerving from the intended part, her injured sister's face again she viewed, and as by surveying both she stood, while this fond boy, she said, can thus express the moving accents of his fond address. Why stands my sister of her tongue bereft, forlorn, and sad, in speechless silence left? O Procne, see the fortune of your house, such as your fate when matched to such a spouse. Conjugal duty, if observed to him, would change from virtue and become a crime. For all respect to Tereus must debase noble blood of great Pandion's race. Straight at these words, with big resentment filled, furious her look she flew, and seized her child. Like a fell tigress of the savage kind, that drags the tender suckling of the hind through India's gloomy groves where Ganges laves the shady scene and rouse his streamy waves. Now to a close apartment they were come, far off retired within the spacious dome, when Procne on revengeful mischief bent, home to his heart a piercing poniard sent. Idas with rueful cries, but all too late, holds out his hands and deprecates his fate. Still, at his mother's neck he fondly aims, and strives to melt her with endearing names. Yet still the cruel mother perseveres, nor with concern his bitter anguish hears. This might suffice, but Philomela too across his throat a shining cutlass drew. Then both with knives dissect each quivering part, and carve the butchered limbs with cruel art, which whelmed in boiling cauldrons o'er the fire, or turned on spits in steamy smoke aspire. while the long entries with their slippery floor run down in purple streams of clotted gore. Asked by his wife to this inhuman feast, Tereus unknowingly is made a guest, whilst she her plot the better to disguise styles it some unknown mystic sacrifice, and such the nature of the hallowed rite, the wife her husband could only invite. The slaves must all withdraw and be debarred the sight. Tereus, upon a throne of antique state, loftily raised before the banquet sate, and glutton-like, luxuriously pleased, with his own flesh his hungry maw appeased. Nay, such a blindness o'er his senses falls, that he for Itys to the table calls. When Procne, now impatient to disclose the joy that from her full revenge arose, cries out in transports of a cruel mind, "Within yourself your Itys you may find." Still, at this puzzling answer with surprise around the room, he sends his curious eyes, and, as he still inquired and called aloud, fierce Philomena, all besmeared with blood, her hands with murder stained, her spreading hair hanging dishevelled with a ghastly air, stepped forth and flung full in the tyrant's face the head of Itys, gory as it was, nor ever so much to use her tongue, and with just reproach to vindicate her wrong. The Thracian monarch from the table flings, while with his cries the vaulted parlor rings. His imprecations echo down to hell, and rouse the snaky furies from their Stygian cell. One while he labors to disgorge his breast and free his stomach from the cursed feast. Then, weeping o'er his lamentable doom, he styles himself the sun's sepulchral tomb. Now, with drawn saber and impetuous speed, in close pursuit he drives Pandion's breed, whose nimble feet spring with so swift a force across the fields they seem to wing their course, and now on real wings themselves they raise, and steer their airy flight by different ways. One to the woodland shady covert hies, around the smoky roof the other flies, whose feathers yet the marks of murder stain, where stamped upon her breast the crimson spots remain. Tereus, through grief and haste to be revenged, shares the like fate, and to a bird is changed. Fixed on his head the crested plumes appear, long is his beak and sharpened like a spear. Thus armed, his looks his inward mind display, and to a lapwing turned he fans his way. Exceeding trouble for his children's fate, shortened Pandion's days and changed his date. Down to the shades below with sorrow spent, an earlier unexpected ghost he went. Boreas in love. Erechtheus next the Athenian sceptre swayed, whose rule the state with joint consent obeyed. So mixed his justice with his valor flowed, his reign one scene of princely goodness showed. 4 hopeful youths, as many females bright, sprung from his loins and soothed him with delight. 2 of these sisters of a lovelier air excelled the rest, though all the rest were fair. Procne to Cephalus in wedlock tied, blessed the young sylvan with a blooming bride. For Erythea, Boreas suffered pain, for the coy maid sued long, but sued in vain. Tereus, his neighbor in his Thracian blood, against the match a main objection stood, which made his vows and all his suppliant love empty as air and ineffectual prove. But when he found his soothing flatteries fail, nor saw his soft addresses could avail, blustering with ire, he quickly has recourse to rougher arts on his own native force. "'Tis well," he said, "such usage is my due, when thus disguised by foreign ways I sue, when my stern airs and fierceness I declaim, and sigh for love, ridiculously tame. When soft addresses foolishly I try, nor my own stronger remedies apply, by force and violence I chiefly live, by them the lowering stormy tempests drive, in foaming billows raise the hoary deep, writhe knotted oaks and sandy deserts sweep, congeal the falling flakes of fleecy snow, and bruise with rattling haul the plains below. Aye, and my brother's winds, when joined above, through the waste champion of the skies we rove, with such a boisterous full career engaged that heaven whole concave thunders at our rage, while struck with nitrous clouds fierce lightnings play, dart through the storm and gild the gloomy day. Or when in subterraneous caverns pent, my breath against the hollow earth is bent, the quaking world above and ghosts below, my mighty power, my dear experience know, tremble with fear and dread the fatal blow. This is the only cure to be applied. Thus, to Erechtheus I should be allied, and thus the scornful virgin should be wooed, not by entreaty, but by force subdued. Boreas in passion spoke these huffing things, and as he spoke he shook his dreadful wings, at which afar the shivering sea was fanned, and the wide surface of the distant land. His dusty mantle o'er the hills he drew, and swept the lowly valleys as he flew. Then with his yellow wings embraced the maid, and wrapped in dusky clouds far off conveyed. The sparkling blaze of love's prevailing fire shone brighter as he flew, and flamed the higher. And now the god, possessed of his delight, to northern Thrace pursued his airy flight, where the young ravished nymph became his bride, and soon the luscious sweets of wedlock tried. Two lovely twins, the effect of this embrace, crowned their soft labors and their nuptials grace, who like their mother beautiful and fair, their father's strength and feathered pinion share. Yet these at first were wanting, as 'tis said, and after as they grew their shoulders spread. Zethus and Calus, the pretty twins, remained unfledged, while smoothed their beardless chins. But when in time the budding silver down shaded their face, and on their cheeks was grown, two sprouting wings upon their shoulders sprung, like those in birds that veil the callow young. Then, as their age advanced, they began from greener youth to ripen into man. With Jason's Argonauts they crossed the seas, embarked in quest of the famed golden fleece. There, with the rest, the first frail vessel tried, and boldly ventured on the swelling tide.